Hello, everyone. You are listening to another episode of the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. I'm your host, Jeanene Wolfe, and I'm joined today by April Snow. April is a licensed psychotherapist, author, consultant, and Sensitive Stories podcast host. She specializes in working with highly sensitive people and therapists to help calm the storm of overwhelm, anxiety, and self-doubt to allow their innate sensitive strengths to shine through. Deeply committed to changing the narrative of what it means to be highly sensitive, April has created and led HSP workshops all over the country as well as online through her Sensitive School. So today we're going to talk about working with or as a highly sensitive person, because everything is going to apply to the therapist as well as people who may or may not be highly sensitive, but working with those clients and don't even know that they might have this until they actually get into your practice. So just a little primer here for people to know more about this. So welcome, April.
Thank you so much, Jeanine. I'm so excited to be talking with you.
Yeah, I'm so happy to have you here. Okay, so I think a good starting place would be, let's talk about what it means to be HSP. If there's if there are traits or a definition or whatever you can share with us about that.
Absolutely. So being highly sensitive means that you're born with innate traits where you process information more deeply. You're also feeling everything more deeply, but I think that's the kind of the misconception. That's the whole part of the trait, but actually it's thinking, processing, reflecting deeply. And then you also are more perceptive, noticing little details. And when you're so perceptive and so emotional, you're naturally more empathetic, it's easy to get overstimulated. So that's often what I call the Achilles heel of the traits. It's the most difficult part when you're so spongy and you take so much in. And a lot of times clinicians are going to see HSPs in that state where they're chronically overwhelmed, overstimulated, struggling with their mental health because they don't know that they're highly sensitive or they're not able to take care of themselves because it's hard to live a different lifestyle than most people around you. So it can be difficult.
Absolutely. I know that it also means that people don't have patience for you at times, probably because they don't understand why your nervous system is different than theirs and why you have these things going on, and can't you just toughen up a little bit?
It's so true. You know, a lot of HSPs go throughout their lives being told their experience isn't valid or isn't true. But yeah, our brains, our nervous systems are wired differently, where we're taking in more information, we're feeling everything more deeply. 30% of humans are highly sensitive. So it's a necessary trait. You need those people that are noticing and feeling and taking their time to make strong decisions. But others don't quite understand because it makes sense, right? We don't have that lived experience. We don't understand how you could possibly feel so much and be so intuitive and perceptive. It's just not something you can really fathom when you don't have that nervous system.
Yes. And like so many things in life, you don't know that you're different than others because you've only ever lived in your own brain until something happens where you get this exposure to this and you're like, oh, that explains so much.
Exactly. Until you have that light bulb moment. But it's true. I think a lot of us grew up thinking, oh, I know I'm different. And I hear HSPs talk about that all the time. Like, I knew something was different about me. But then you think, well, I just need to be like everybody else. I had that experience too. I think I have to be more social. I have to be, more quick-witted. I have to be less bothered. So you kind of try to force yourself into this non-HSP pretzel that just doesn't work because, sensitivity, you're born with it. It's not going away. Mm-hmm. So you really have to learn about what it is and how to live as an HSP.
Yeah, that's important. Mm-hmm. And I also, as you're describing it, I feel like there's a lot of overlap with ADHD. Is there a higher correlation of people with ADHD who are also HSP?
I don't know that we've seen research that defines that specifically around the numbers, but absolutely you see a lot of shared experiences, because I see high sensitivity, ADHD, and autism being under the same neurodivergent umbrella. And we're seeing so many overlaps there. I think we have a lot more to learn. But I do think that we're all kind of in the same family, and you're going to see a lot of overlap with environmental sensitivity and processing. So there's definitely more to learn, but I would say most likely, yes, that those two are correlated in some way.
Right. So this isn't a diagnosis. It's more of, is it considered personality traits or characteristics? What words should people use?
It's a great question. A lot of people do equate it as a diagnosis because HSPs that you're seeing in therapy a lot of times are struggling with anxiety, OCD, complex trauma, because we're more impacted by our environment, our experiences, but it's actually a temperament trait. So it's something you're born with. It's even prior to personality being formed, because like I said, there's an evolutionary advantage to being more perceptive, more sensitive, to notice the little details, pick out the dangers, keep everyone safe. So we're going really far back biological here. So yeah, it's just something you're born with, and there's an advantage to it. I think we forget that, or we're not able to see that in our modern lifestyle, where the HSPs that we can tell are HSPs are the ones that are chronically dysregulated, emotional, hypersensitive, hypervigilant. But the HSPs that are balanced, living kind of a supportive lifestyle, you would never guess that they're more sensitive because they don't fit the stereotype of sensitivity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that makes me think of, I do a comparison with working with ADHD clients or neurodivergent clients, that it's just a preferred neurotype in our society. Like our society prefers extroverts over introverts. We prefer morning, the morning, what is it called? Morning bird, early bird.
Yes, versus the night owl. Yeah.
Versus the night owl. And so we come to view that as wrong or weak or inappropriate, when it's really like we need all of the types.
That's right. Exactly. There's this extrovert ideal, there's this neurotypical ideal, but we don't realize just how much the sensitive, neurodivergent folks are offering to us. The HSPs in your life are the ones that are your emotional caretakers, support systems, right? They're the ones that remind you to go to the doctor. They're the ones that notice when something's off with you, maybe even before you do. They're the ones that, remember to change the smoke detectors, to get everyone to the doctor for your annual visits. We are the kind of quietly in the background offering so much, but oftentimes people don't realize what we're bringing to the table. And we don't even realize it ourselves.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think with all types of neurodiversity, knowledge is power. To learn exactly what it is about you that's different than other people, so you can own it and compensate if necessary, but just know, okay, this isn't just me being, annoying to my friends. This is how I exist in the world.
That's right. You're right. You're not being a problem. You just happen to be different. And that difference, offers a lot. But it can take a while to really internalize that point of view, because we've grown up being told too much of this, you're not enough of that, you need to change, you need to be like everyone else. But that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah. Okay. So are there differences in approaches when you're working with a client who's HSP?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot to take into account for the HSP client. And, Dr. Elaine Aron, who kind of put the trait on the map, says that up to half of clients are highly sensitive, which makes sense. We're more impacted. We're more likely to pursue therapy. We like that internal work. So when an HSP client comes into your office, whether it's in person or over telehealth, there's some things to consider, I think, foundationally before we even get to the clinical material. One, making sure that you're giving space for their depth of processing, which just means their brain is wired to pause and reflect before they do anything. So they're not going to be able to just jump right into the material. Or if they are, maybe they're feeling dysregulated as they do that. So is there space for them to transition in and out of the session? That's really important. So I noticed some client, a lot of HSP clients, very conscientious. They want to do it right, and they want to be the perfect client. So really looking for that. How can you slow things down for them? How can you create an environment where they get to go at the pace they need to go? Whether that's giving them a moment at the beginning of the session to do a short experiential exercise, regulate them before you're getting started, creating a moment at the end of the session for them to start to transition out and integrate the material right then. During the session, are they getting distracted, flustered, dysregulated? Do they need some space to slow down, to journal right there in the session, to do a creative expressive exercise, to do some movements? How can you work with their nervous system and how their brain works in the session? And a little bit goes a long way, right? And just think about an HSP whose their whole lives have been rushed, have been put in this box. So to be in the session where they get to go at their own rhythm is so healing. You actually feel seen, and your nervous system gets an opportunity to slow down. So that's a big part of the process, is thinking about how their brain works and how you can match the pace of the session for them. Yeah, and I could say more. I'll take a moment there.
Yeah, so I love the idea of really, which I think many of us have begun doing anyway, incorporating more somatic techniques, mindfulness, things like that. So it becomes, if we practice with them in session each time, it doesn't have to be more than several minutes, then we are really sort of helping them rewire their brain so that they can, outside of the session, more easily access that.
Absolutely. I think nervous system regulation tools has to be part of the HSP session as much as they're ready for it, right? And obviously we need to consider, HSPs are more impacted by trauma. So you may be seeing an HSP whose nervous system is in a dysregulated state, maybe chronically. So we really need to take that into consideration. But giving them tools, help them understand, help them recognize what overstimulation looks like and feels like. And right, a little bit goes a long way, especially for an HSP. We have that feature of sensitivity, which is called differential susceptibility, which means we're more impacted negatively, but also more impacted positively.
Okay.
So every little support you can bring into the session is going to go quite far for them.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And it makes a whole lot of sense.
Yes.
So kind of we sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to make sure, and I'm sure you do too, that we put out there that sensitivity does not equate to weakness. That's how our society often views that. So because not only are they more sensitive, but they're getting judged more by society, I would imagine building resilience would be a part of your work. And if you can do that without them learning to just suppress the highly sensitive parts of themselves.
Absolutely. And I think people don't realize that sensitive people are actually very resilient.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't seem that way, but I like to remind my clients, just think about, and sometimes my clients will remind me, just think about all that an HSP experiences throughout a given day. So if you have someone who's not highly sensitive, they're taking in maybe 10 data points in an experience. An HSP is taking in hundreds of data points, the smells, the textures, the body language, and they're feeling everything they go through more intensely, not just the day-to-day, but obviously the more complex emotional experiences. So I think already we're more resilient. We just have to remember that. And working with your sensitivity, I think a lot of times people assume it's, just kind of being a recluse at home, not doing anything, just shutting everything down. And that's not the case. We actually need to build up our nervous systems, right? Mm-hmm. To create that exposure to stimulation, to experience, to make, to have just the ability to handle more. So yes, definitely working on resilience, emotionally, nervous system-wise, keeping HSPs engaged in their lives. It's not about shutting everything off. You can actually live a very productive, successful, engaged lifestyle as an HSP. It's just make sure you have those counterbalances, right? Every week, make sure you're getting time to process, to reflect, to rest, get enough sleep, and more sleep than you think you need. This can go a long way.
Yeah. So we talked about, so let's look at offering a safe, inclusive therapy environment for clients and also for the therapists themselves. What are some things you would suggest?
Yeah. I mean, from the client's perspective, I would say make sure that you're being curious, you're checking your biases against sensitivity. Whether or not you're an HSP, you might even have internalized bias against sensitivity by just the messaging we've heard in society, from our families, sometimes even fellow clinicians do not understand the trait of high sensitivity. It's not something most of us learned in school. I definitely didn't, because the research, the bulk of it is in the last 30 years, and it's just starting to ramp up even more internationally in the last 10 years or so. So it's not something that's been integrated into the curriculum at this point. So we really need to do our own research, learn that it's a real innate trait, and also how it presents as other diagnoses, like borderline personality disorder, like autism, like OCD, or, generalized anxiety disorder, and learn to peel those apart. Usually they can be separate or they can coexist. But just really making sure that you understand the trait and an HSP experience. And there's lots of ways to do that. You can watch the sensitive documentary that Elaine Aron put out. You can watch My Sensitive Stories YouTube videos just to see HSPs talking about their own lives. You can read Psychotherapy in the Highly Sensitive Person book by Dr. Aron. That's a great place to start. It's probably definitely the most in-depth from a clinical perspective, because just reminding yourself that, HSPs have often been gaslit and validated. Make sure you're not doing that in the therapy session, right? Mm-hmm. Really listen to what they're telling you, while also keeping an eye out for if there's something else going on here besides high sensitivity, or if the client is coming with high sensitivity, but actually there's something else going on. So it's very complex to pull that apart.
Very complex. Yeah, absolutely. And so just from an insurance perspective, so you have ruled out that it's generalized anxiety disorder. So how are you diagnosing them for the purposes of being paid by insurance?
Sure. It's a great question. So a lot of times the HSPs are coming in and they do have anxiety, right? Maybe they are having, cognitive obsessions, ruminating quite a bit, or trying to be, perfect for everyone. Maybe sometimes HSPs have had complex trauma. A lot of times they have, because they're more affected by it. So oftentimes they are coexisting. So I want to make sure that's clear. A lot of times it's a both end. It's a sensitive person coming in that has an innate trait, but then has had the experiences where they've developed a mental health issue, or they've had complex trauma, or there's something else going on there. Maybe they're also on the spectrum. So then, you would bill insurance accordingly. It's rare that an HSP is coming to therapy and they are not struggling in some way. Usually you're seeing the HSPs that are having some issue where it would warrant a mental health diagnosis. But just know those two don't always go hand in hand. They're separate.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay, that's an important point. But then if we want to participate in the medical model of therapy, then we have to play the game and do the diagnoses that will get covered.
Absolutely. And most HSPs, we're more chronically overstimulated, which often presents as anxiety. We're more dysregulated. So a lot of times we can fit into that box for sure.
Mm-hmm. So I think that boundaries must be a really important skill to teach these clients, or for therapists themselves to have. Can you talk about that some?
Oh, yes. Boundaries are so essential. I'm so glad you brought this up, because I think it's a must for every HSP. And we can talk about it from the client perspective and the therapist perspective. For clients, or for any human, let's just take it from that perspective. When you're a highly sensitive human, unless you have boundaries, you're not getting the downtime you need. Right? That time for processing, for rest, for integrating your experiences, for making sense of your emotions. And that's where we start to get overstimulated, anxious, chronically dysregulated, then mental health issues develop. Maybe we're then falling into a depression. All sorts of issues can pop up. So boundaries are the essential piece for getting that time that we need. However, we have to do work before that, which is understanding our sensitivity is real, it's valid, and working through the guilt of setting those boundaries. Because when we're highly empathetic, we have more active mirror neurons in our brains as sensitive people. So we're highly empathetic, and it's very difficult to put our own needs to the forefront, because we understand, we feel what the impact is going to be on another person for saying no, for disappointing them. So a lot of work around guilt, self-acceptance, and then finally being able to set the boundaries is key. And then as a clinician, this comes in so many different ways, but at the very beginning, really being clear on your screening process. I think that is absolutely essential. So even before clients come in the door, get clear on how do you work, who do you work best with, when do you work, where do you work, right? And really making sure that you're putting your needs at the front. And because if not, you're not going to be able to sustain this work if you don't consider that. And then, of course, making sure that you're not available outside of your working hours unless obviously there's a crisis, and then doing your own work to not take on emotionally the client experience. There's lots of ways boundaries show up. I think at the very least, looking at your screening process and then when you're available could be kind of the two pillars there. Yeah, there's so much to talk about here.
Yeah, one of the topics that comes up quite frequently, actually, is in the consultation groups that I facilitate, is this understanding when and how you work best. So I will say, okay, at the end of each session, write down, how do you feel? Do you feel great? You did great work with this client. It was really hard, but it felt good. Okay. You've seen 3 clients in a row. When you get to that third, how are you feeling after that session? Can you realistically do 3 in a row? Or do you need to space it out? All of those things that we're not taught in grad school that are essential, because we have to work with what works best for us and then own that and be able to say to the client, this is the schedule that I use and it's better for everyone.
That's exactly it. It's better for everyone. And when that guilt comes up, I always remind folks that what's best for you is best for your clients, right? Even if you're referring out, that could be best for the client. If you know this client needs a certain schedule, needs a certain approach that isn't in your wheelhouse or what you're most passionate about or what you do best, you're not going to serve this client well. It's not fair to take this client. I know we're like, oh, but this client reached out to me and I want to, support them. Supporting them could be referring them off to someone else, or it could be saying, I can't see you at noon, but I can see you at 1 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Even just
Yeah.
slight adjustments.
And I really, since the pandemic, I really noticed for myself and the other therapists that I know that making one wrong decision with taking on a client that's not the right fit for you, or keeping a client because you feel guilty about referring out, it impacts your entire caseload. It impacts you and it impacts everybody else. So I'm like, if the only way you can do this without feeling guilty is to think about all your other clients who maybe aren't going to get the best of you because you don't have it left by the time you see them.
Oh, I have been there. There's two specific instances that stand out in my career where one client hijacked my whole practice. And I thought, okay, they want to work with me. I think I can support them. But when you actually get into the work, realizing this is not a good fit, and that I'm not doing notes, I'm not present for my other sessions, I'm using all my extra time to consult around this particular client. And it has this ripple effect. So the way in, I think, for sensitive clinicians is go through the empathy. Think about your other clients, right? Think about this client who would be better served with someone who's an expert at what they need support with, or who has a different schedule, or who takes their insurance. All the different pieces that could be a mismatch, that this client would be better suited elsewhere. I know it's hard, though, to do.
It is hard to do. Well, one of the things, and I think by the time you've been in this field quite a while, you sort of figure this out for yourself. But, there's those clients over the years where I'm like really iffy about if they're going to be a good fit. Should I take this client on? Every single time I ignore that gut feeling, I regret it later. So I'm like, follow your gut. You have experience. You have training. If something inside of you is screaming, no, then deal with it now instead of later when you decide like, okay, yeah, this is taking a toll on everybody. This is not going to keep working.
Exactly. Although it's still uncomfortable, it's so much harder once you've built a relationship with a client. Right. And then it becomes potentially more negatively impactful for that client to be referred out. And as sensitive therapists, remind yourself that you have strong intuition. Part of being highly sensitive is being more perceptive, taking in more subtle detail. Even if you're not conscious of it, you're taking in a lot of information. And then you get that gut feeling and you don't quite know where that's coming from, but trust it. It's actually based on data. You just don't realize it. So trust. If something feels off and you can't, that's the hardest thing when you can't put your finger on it. Like, well, but everything looks like it lines up on paper. But if you feel like something is off, there's a reason.
Yeah, let's say that again. You don't have to take that client on.
Exactly. Right. Trust yourself. Like you said, once you've been in this field for a while, you know how it goes. You know how this is going to play out. Get ahead of it.
Yeah. Okay. So we all used to proudly use the term self-care, been so reduced, and it describes so many things that aren't really what people need for self-care. That bubble bath is not going to solve all your problems. So with all of that in mind, and part of it is self-care can be anything that you need that helps you feel better, exist better. So are there specific ones that you recommend for HSP clients or therapists?
Absolutely. I mean, we already talked about downtime, and everyone talks about downtime, right? It's that quiet space that you need to do your mental processing, your emotional processing. So that's a given. And to get that downtime, remember, set your boundaries. But I think more important equally as important is, and for lack of a better word, I just call it meaningful self-care. It's doing those practices, those activities, spending time with those people that really fill you up. So we want to process and empty out, but then fill back up with whatever that looks like for you. It could be cooking, it could be hiking, it could be playing video games, it could be reading, it could be doing yoga, whatever it is. And I just want to specify that it's very subjective, it's very individual. I think we get caught in that every HSP needs the same protocol. Not true.
Right. Yeah.
30% of humans are highly sensitive. We're all so different. So what fills you up? And making sure you're doing that every week at some level. That's going to be really important. So more downtime, definitely more sleep. 80 to 85% of HSPs I've come in contact with need 9 hours of sleep. So lean into that. Even if you don't get any other time during the day, prioritize sleep. And then, yes, spending time with people that understand you or at least accept you, really important. I think that's a critical piece of self-care. Even if it's just one person in your life where you can unmask and you can let your walls down. But then, doing things that fill you up. We crave that deep dive, that meaning, that depth as sensitive people. So making sure that you're immersing in something that's important to you every week is critical.
Okay. So This sort of reminds me of, as a therapist working with HSP clients, as a therapist with ADHD, I have ADHD clients and I struggle with, okay, so you completely forgot about your appointment. I really want to give you grace for that because I know why that happened and where it came from. But I also need an income to, pay myself, pay my bills and all of that. So it can make having a sustainable practice pretty tricky. So I'd love any thoughts you have about that.
About sticking to your business practices?
The sustainability. I mean, at this point in my career, I'm like, I don't often enforce my no-show late cancellation policy because I often know what the reason is. And my clients are so accepting. They'll even say like, hey, please go ahead and charge me. So I'm very flexible with that because it works for me. But at times it doesn't feel sustainable.
It's true. I mean, it's tricky because when you're more empathetic, I always say this, I can never get mad at anyone because I understand where they're coming from all the time. Yes. I mean, it's a blessing and a curse. I think at some point, though, we have to, it's so hard, but kind of separate the business aspect of the work that we do. In this session, yes, we're empathetic, we're humans relating and connecting and supporting. But at the end of the day, I think it's really important to be as consistent as you can. And maybe you have those exceptions. Like I personally am very strict with my cancellation policy. However, I've had clients who were going through cancer treatment, who were pregnant, who have a chronic illness, who have a job it's very difficult for them to be on time. So I do make some adjustments for those clients when it makes sense. At the foundation, I'm pretty strict, I would say. Just because exactly what you said, we have to support ourselves, but it's hard emotionally, empathetically to do that at times. But I just, again, with thinking about what's the ripple effects on all of my clients if I'm not feeling financially secure, and it really does come out clinically, I found. And it can impact my point of view on when a client needs to cancel or when it's time for them to decrease frequency, right? Things like that. I'd notice I'll get clouded. So I try to be really firm with and as a sensitive person, for me, that feels really good on my nervous system. And I don't have to go into that emotional processing every time. So I know this is my policy.
Yeah.
This is it.
Yeah. And the point that I want to make sure people get here is that I support everyone doing for their practice what works best for them.
Same. Absolutely.
And I actually don't have late cancellations or no-shows very often. So that's probably why I can see it very often, because it just doesn't happen very often. And when it does, I'm like, oh, there's really, I have a couple of clients who have autoimmune diseases and they can wake up and just like, it's not going to happen today.
Exactly.
And so they know that I just say, give me as much notice as possible. Try to get you in later in the week. But yeah, I mean, if it's happening all the time, then, I won't take on any more chronically ill clients because of that right now, because that's part of that balance as well.
Exactly. And I appreciate you saying that. We really need to do what works best for us, because there's some clinicians, I know therapists that don't have any late cancellation policy at all. They just don't charge. And that works for them. And I love that. That's great. Right? Because clients get to have that flexibility. Sometimes I think not having the structure can be harmful depending on the client. It just reminds me of being a kid and, I don't know what the rules are. My nervous system is dysregulated because of that. So I think we also need to consider that. And what's the impact of not having structure? But that can be subjective based on the client. So the key to sustainability, I think, is whatever works for you. For me, I like structure with that kind of emotional flexibility as needed. But for other clinicians, that's going to feel so suffocating, and it's not going to even work for them, let alone their clients. So I love that personalization. I think that's so important.
Right. And the other thing is, we learn about countertransference, but we don't really learn about it as business owners. And so when I first went out on my own in private practice, I'd been with a group and I didn't understand, like, some insurance companies reimburse me half of what another one does. And then all of a sudden I was like so ashamed because I was like, I'm thinking about this when this client is in here and I don't thinking about that. That's, that's not their fault. That's their insurance. I agreed to accept their insurance. And darn it, they're telling me they bought a new pair of shoes and I'm getting paid half of what someone else would pay me. And so being aware of those resentments, and just saying like, okay, so for myself, what I did for that specific situation is I went off the lowest paying panels.
Right.
And I was like, okay, now everyone's kind of in the same, realm, a range of what they're paying me, but making sure that we're not unintentionally setting ourselves up for resentment.
Absolutely. 'Cause especially as a highly sensitive clinician, you're going to feel that so much more deeply, and you're going to notice it at a much subtle level. So for a non-HSP clinician, you might only feel resentful if a client's going on a fancy vacation or buying a really expensive purse or something like that, right? But for an HSP, you might start to get resentful, like, oh, that client went out to dinner this week. I wasn't able to do that. Or, oh, I noticed they come in with a coffee every day and I have to make mine at home. Whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's going to happen a lot more subtly. So yeah, how can you set up your practice where that you buffer as much as you can from those feelings and knowing that you can make changes? I think we get locked in, and it's okay to say, this insurance doesn't work for me anymore. Or, I want to make some other change in my practice. This day doesn't work for me anymore. I remember when I finally took off Fridays, it took me a couple of years. This was a while ago. And then once it was like, oh, right. Now my practice functions so much better for me. And like, what decisions you need to make to do that? It's to make the work more sustainable.
Yeah. And I love, changing things up. You mentioned that. That we are in a great field for that, in my opinion. People are afraid, like, I need to change my schedule. I'm like, the many times I've changed my schedule or my days or my hours or whatever over the years, and the clients are either like, oh, great, yeah, I can make that change. Or if not, I can refer them out. But I'm still going to make the change if I've decided that's what's best for me and my practice and my, caseload.
Absolutely. Often clients are pretty flexible with that. I mean, for us, we agonize over it, whether it's a fee change, a schedule change. The first few years of my practice, I was always so worried whenever my need would come in. And now, like, it's okay to be a human. It's okay to model that, make adjustments. That's what we're constantly needing to do as sensitive people. And realizing, oh, this no longer works for me. Let me do this instead. We get to do that as clinicians too. Obviously, you don't want to be changing your schedule every week, but, annually makes sense. I changed my schedule every year, I would imagine. Always making adjustments.
Yes. And if you're going to move all of your clients onto Zoom sessions,
right.
You may not anticipate how many are going to struggle with that.
Exactly.
Video sessions.
Right. But that's okay. And it's a great opportunity to work through things in real time with clients.
Yeah. Okay. So are there any other thoughts or points or suggestions you want to make sure we cover today?
That's a great question. I think we covered all the main points, just talking about how high sensitivity is innate, how it's often confused with other types of diagnoses. So we really need to look more closely with clients that could be highly sensitive. Does that depth of processing show up across the lifespan? Really looking at it in a more nuanced way versus just labeling it, oh, that's anxiety, that's trauma, or something else. And then really educating ourselves about the trait is going to be important, especially if we don't have that lived experience.
Yeah. And as you're talking, I'm sort of thinking about, I've interviewed therapists with so many different types of client populations. And, I think like, oh, well, that would be a good question for the intake form. But then, it's like, am I going to add 100 more questions to my intake form? And I think you will agree with me, but my thought is basically just be open to what's going to come your way. And if I know in the past I would have these moments of panic in a session, like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to help this client. And you learn that you don't have to know that right this minute. No. You don't even have to decide right this minute if you're going to keep them, but allow yourself to be a curious learner, which I think therapists are anyway. Most therapists I know are constantly taking courses and reading books and all that kind of stuff. So just being prepared that, okay, this is not my specialty, but they came to me for my specialty, but this is part of who they are as a person. So where can I educate myself to do better with that person?
Exactly. Right. We were working with so many different pieces. A client will come in with one presenting issue, but they're human. There's so many things that unfold over time, and there's no way to be an expert in every single piece that they're bringing in, but we have that foundation of the relationship that we can build off of. And we can at least be supportive. We can hold a space for them as they explore. We don't have to have it all figured out. And even if someone's coming in and they're saying right off the bat, I'm a highly sensitive person, oftentimes that's not the main focus. It's more the experiences they're having because of their sensitivity that we're diving into. That is just kind of the backdrop. So let it inform how you're seeing this client, but it's not the main part of the work, right? It's more likely to be anxiety or relationships or maybe an eating disorder or whatever the client is coming in with. So just know that you can still support this client without being an expert. And doing what you can to learn. Read the Psychotherapy and the Highly Sensitive Person book, watch the documentary, go to sensitivityresearch.com and learn the facts about the trait, right? You can do that in 10 or 15 minutes to start to learn more. And so you can personally embody believing that this trait is real and bring that into the client session. Even just in the background can make a big difference.
And I sometimes think clients throw those things out kind of early on because they're testing you. They've had so many bad experiences with therapists or other medical providers. And so if you tell your therapist pretty soon on, like, hey, I'm a highly sensitive person, and they go, what?
Right. That's
and they're
very
not like,
telling.
they're not like, know a lot about that, but I'm happy to do some research so I can better understand it and support you. Like, that's all you need to do.
That's it. Exactly. And you're so right. Clients just want to know, is this a safe space? Can I be myself? Yeah.
Right. All right. Well, I have my final question. Please share with us your favorite catchphrase or analogy that you like to use.
One that I love to bring into session with clients is the metaphor of sensitivity being equated with orchids. So there's this flower metaphor that shows up in the research. So highly sensitive people are orchids. The medium sensitivity folks are tulips, and then low sensitivity folks are dandelions. And this is a great metaphor for understanding what you need as an HSP to flourish. So just thinking about the care that orchids need, it's more specialized. We talked about self-care. They need more specialized self-care. That looks differently than what other people need. But when you allow yourself to get more downtime, to get more sleep, to immerse in things that fill you up, to work on your healing, to calm your nervous system, you start to see the best parts of the trait come through. That perception, that intuition, that empathy, that creativity, we're strong decision makers and problem solvers. All those pieces that get buried under the overwhelm or the anxiety start to come to the surface. So I just love this metaphor because it's a great way to remind yourself that it's okay to need something different. Look what's possible. It's a visual metaphor.
I love that. Yeah. That just makes so much sense because you can imagine each of those flowers and how they show up in the world. And
and they all have value just in different ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Well, April, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. We will share information about how they can connect with you in the show notes. So for all you hardworking therapists out there, please remember our work is hard, but it doesn't have to be lonely.